Welcome back. We are on part 4 of our workshop, focusing on this concept of inquiry and how we can be applying inquiry into our lessons, and especially be thinking about how we can look for inquiry in our standards. What should standards look like when we are focusing on this concept of inquiry? In today's part, it's really going to focus on the disciplinary concepts that we work with. So, be thinking about our civics concepts, geography, history, and economics. Those will be the big 4 we're going to look at. And we're going to be really thinking of what concepts in those 4 disciplines need to be in our standards, and we're just going to be workshopping a little bit and seeing how that might look like when we're actually lesson planning. Alright, so before we go into the workshop, I wanted to use the C3 framework to introduce what we're talking about. We can see we're here on the cover again. I'll scroll down to our table of contents, and what we're going to focus on today is Dimension 2, Applying Disciplinary Concepts and Tools, page 29. So if you have the C3 framework out in front of you, feel free to check it out. Be following along. Pause me anytime you'd like. That way you can find your place to read the sections if you'd like to. And we see that we have 4 main disciplines that the C3 framework focuses on. We got civics, economics, geography, and history. And we can see that each one has an actual different set of these subsections. So for civics, we have civic and political institutions, we have participation, deliberation, and then processes, rules, and laws. And those sections really just organize a set of standards that a bunch of social studies teachers got together and thought were the most important concepts in those disciplines. But really, it's up to us in our state how we would like to apply this framework, if at all, and really be thinking of our own values and what we see as being integral to these disciplines. So we have 4 different ones, and I'll just go ahead and scroll down to economics. So we have economics here. We can see it gives us a little bit, a description of why economics is important. Again, feel free to pause me if you want to. If we keep on scrolling down, we see these sections again, those same sections that were in the table of contents. So economic decision making is right here. And just like all of the other dimensions in the C3 framework, they come with standards that are vertically aligned. So we see when it comes to this idea of economic decision making, we have standards here that are vertically aligned from grades 2, which really, that's by the end of grade 2, so kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And we see even here it says K through 2, which means kindergarten through 2nd grade. Explain how scarcity necessitates decision making. And so we would want to see what that actually means, translate that into a kindergarten or 1st grade class. What are some things that become scarce in a class? I think it could be fun to talk about how we have a scarce amount of art supplies. So how does that affect our decision making? That's what economics is. It's the idea of supply and demand, which has a cause and effect. And it's just a way for us to start showing students that these really important economic concepts do exist in our everyday lives, and we can base that in our everyday interactions with students or a lesson or unit that we teach. If we keep scrolling, we'll see that there are others like exchange of markets, and again, if we scroll down, we see these elementary grades have quite a few standards. I was reviewing the South Dakota standards, and I realized there's a lot more economic standards in the elementary grades than we do have in South Dakota. So that could be a conversation of, should we increase our standards? Should we keep them the way they are? Should we decrease them? Really, that's up to the teachers and how they can kind of see things working out for themselves. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of things to look at, and a lot of them focus on those, really important verbs again, like describe. We see here, we have explain right here. We even have a couple identifies, which are a little lower on the cognitive level. But we really see the C3 framework designers really focus on this idea of description and explanation. They want students to be able to describe and explain in their own words, not just, regurgitate something that they memorize for the teacher, not, try to pass some kind of, quiz on a Friday. And in the younger grades, I know we don't do that as much, but we are starting to see more of the standardized testing kind of work seep into the lower grades. And so we as teachers have to decide, do we like that? Do we want to continue with that? Or do we want to focus more on this inquiry idea and thinking about how we would assess it? So those are the standards. Again, it keeps on going. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump into a lesson plan now, and then we're going to get into just a little bit of what assessment could possibly look like. All right, so we are back on our same Google document that we've been using, and I know teachers have asked me where can they find these resources, and you should have access to them now. Either near the video description or wherever you're finding this video, you should have access to it. But if not, please feel free to reach out to me and I can help you find it. So the same Google Doc, as you can see, up here is where we left off last time, where we had talked about aligning questions with assessment. So we were looking at those C3 framework concepts of how do we actually work with questions, how do we create them, how do we organize them. And now there's a new section called Assessment Alignment, Applying and Assessing Disciplinary Concepts and Skills. That's what we're really going to focus on today. And you see here too, I have the same set of standards that we've been working with. So I'll go ahead and scroll up again. Again, same exact document. We see up here, we've been using the same standards. They're still crossed out from last time, so I'm trying to remember exactly what standards I use. And that's exactly how I really operate when I'm doing any kind of assessment design. I always go back to the standards and ask myself, am I hitting on those big concepts, those big standards that, either the state or the social studies profession is hoping I'll hit. And as you remember, I picked some state South Dakota standards, some C3 standards, and our OSEUs. That idea of oral tradition is also within this lesson plan. And that's why standards are so important. That's why we do this work, because we want to be figuring out what things we have decided, and we as the democratic we, in South Dakota, as social studies teachers or as special groups like the Ocheti Shakowin, we want to decide, or we want to figure out exactly how we can take those concepts that were agreed upon and apply them to our unit plans, which eventually translates to our teaching. So I'm going to scroll back down. So again, passing what we did last time, going all the way down to the bottom. And we're back to our assessment alignment. And these are the standards I really wanted to work with this time, because these are the disciplinary ones. And so these are the big concepts, like historical concepts and geographical concepts, that I want to make sure I hit. Not that the concepts of compelling questions aren't good, they still are, but I wanted to really focus on these, especially for this video. So we see down here that we have our supporting questions that we made last time, so I've organized them now into their own little sections. And so you see here, in yellow, and you got one here in this blue or gray, I can't really tell on my computer, it's kind of pink and red. We have 3 sections, and these represents, either 3 different days or 3 parts of the same unit. Like I've said before, I like to chunk my lessons together. And so let's look at this first one. What does it mean to be a part of a community? What is a community? We actually talked about this last time, and I talked about this warm-up, and I talked a little bit about what we might do for a formative performance task. And so these are the 3 sections that might make up a single, hour in a classroom, or however you organize your time at the elementary level. I know every district's a little bit different, so however you need to translate that to yourself, this is a single, lesson or activity that you would do with your students. And I'll pause here before I move on, because I wanted to remind everyone, I'm really basing it off this thing that we're building towards. Remember, it's one of the first things we did, is we built a summative task and we designed a taking informed action. We did that because we want to know exactly what we're working towards with our students. What, big things we think that they could do based off the knowledge we gave them. And it should be more than just sitting at a desk taking some kind of multiple quiz or multiple choice quiz. It should be more than just regurgitating some memorized knowledge. And although that stuff has a place, I'm afraid that it's just too much of what we do in education. So this is an alternative, right? Students actually taking the knowledge and doing something with it in the classroom and sometimes outside the classroom, depending on what your school can do. So to remind you, as a class, students will create a portfolio that contains their perspectives about the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the 1918 influenza pandemic. And so I really want students to create something that will actually be used for a future class. And I go on explaining that here. Again, feel free to pause me if you want to read that to yourself, or rewind me if you want me to read that again. But the big action we want students to do is create something almost like a collective journal, or a group diary, where they can, say hey, this is what our experiences were. And then maybe students 5 years from now, 10 years, 15, 20, there's plenty of teachers. My mentor taught for 50 years. So imagine you using some materials that your students have created 30 plus years from now to really help your future students understand, hey, this is what happened. Or if you retire, you can give these materials to future teachers and say, hey, this is something that happened in 2019, 2020. We can use it as a primary source. And also our students right now can be really feeling like they're contributing to something. They know their voices will be heard and valued because we're writing it down, or we're putting it into a class yearbook or scrapbook or journal, however you want to call it. So that's what we're working towards. Students will do that. They're going to create these summative entries of their writing. Think about at a 3rd grade level what students are able to do. Use your English language arts standards to figure that out. Actually, I even wrote somewhere in here that this could actually even satisfy a language arts standard. So that's what we're working towards, and every single one of these supporting questions, warm-ups, and formative performance tasks is building towards that over multiple days. and they're all based off these standards. Again, trying to figure out exactly what standards are going to be the most helpful for us moving forward. So I picked these four just because, again, I thought they were going to be either something challenging for me to think about and do, or something I thought would be really valuable for this specific project. All right, so I'll go ahead and talk a little bit about the actual standards themselves. I mentioned it last time. I like to bold or underline things, kind of help me figure things out. And so these two words, compare, came up a lot. This idea of comparing and contrasting. You'll notice that I put that in every single one of the performance tasks. And so that's where I really got this idea from, is I want students to be comparing and contrasting COVID-19 to the influenza pandemic in 1918. I picked the 1918 one because it's probably one of the more popular American, pandemics that we can remember. There are other ones. There's a yellow fever pandemic that happened right after the revolutionary time period that you could study. There's a lot of really good pandemics. If you type in early American history pandemics into Google, you'll find a few, but I think the 1918 one will probably have the most information, so I picked that one. You'll notice again that every single one of these tasks has compare and contrast, so I'll go ahead and bold those real quick. And that's really the goal here, right? We're going to be using these two standards ideas, this idea of comparing and contrasting primary and secondary sources and life today with historical time period. So COVID-19, life today, 1918, historical time period, and then primary and secondary sources. We're going to talk more about that in the next video, because that video is about finding resources that we can use. But we know that the primary source for today is our own experiences. Students can share exactly what COVID-19 was like, and then what they'll do is that can be used as a primary source for future generations if they want to use it. And again, it's just kind of a cool thing to tell students. It's almost like a little time capsule, hey, people are going to read this stuff 40, 50 years from now. And, kind of imagine how cool of an idea that, students can come back as adults. If, I like how South Dakota has these really powerful communities where, people live for 3-4 generations and they could still see the same work that they produced in elementary. I think that'd be such a powerful thing, especially for our South Dakota rural Midwestern communities. So we have that idea of comparing and contrasting. The analyzation is really going to come from more like what they'll do in these warm-ups. So again, I'll find more sources to actually talk about what students are analyzing. But you can see here, I'll read this first one, that students are going to define their community. But next in their notebook, they're going to write 3 sentences as to what makes up your community and why. So again, that idea of analyzing what's going on in our community. And I should also say too, I kind of misspoke earlier. Really, it's in the performance task as well, because students have to describe how both pandemics influence communities, and so they're going to have to think of really this, more analytical of when they look at primary sources for the 1918 pandemic, they're going to have to be pretty analytical and be oh, well, because I'm seeing this, that means this must have happened. That idea of cause and effect that they're going to have to do through analyzing. But again, we'll touch more on that next video. But right now, we just know that we want students to compare and contrast a historical moment with today, and they'll be answering questions, again, all the time, getting ready for this moment right here, the summative tasks. Now, finally, we have one standard that might poke out and seem a little odd, this geography standard talking about migration. And I included it in here at first because I just thought it'd be kind of a cool idea. And I originally had a different lesson idea in my mind. And, I kind of wanted to stick with it just to challenge myself to think. And I like social studies standards because everything's connected to each other. And so I made a migration one to satisfy that standard down here. What is migration? What does it look like for people to migrate? In COVID-19, the 1918 influenza pandemic, we don't immediately think about migration. And I think it's because when we think of migration, we think of these big, massive movements, the big, massive movements from Europe to the Americas when Europeans were settling, or even the big, massive movements from Asian countries over to the Western United States, during the Gold Rush and even times before that. We think of all these massive migration moments, and I think sometimes that makes it abstract for students. And so I wanted to make something where students could actually talk about smaller migrations. And so you see down here, I did that. I asked some questions about, where could you go less? Where did you go to more often? And I think what that'll do is create a more personal story that we can build upon this concept of migration. Because migration, people don't just leave because they want to. A lot of times they leave because of necessity. The European settlers who came, most of the time left, not just being for better opportunities, sure, but it's because something bad was happening in their towns. My heritage is German, and I know my ancestors who came here, there was a blight. There was no food. And very similar to a pandemic, they had to do something about it. And I think today we have those stories of, these kids could share, like, well, we had relatives move in with us, or we had to move to relatives, or we lived in a cabin in the woods for a summer because we just wanted to get away from the bigger towns. I have stories like that, and I think our kids would too. And those are the kind of things that, again, I would never thought of unless I was challenging myself with this standard about migration. So it kind of just goes to show you how these standards can be powerful, because it makes you think differently. And it might take a little while to get the hang of it, but once you do it, it becomes very fun. I think what you'll find is your students will enjoy it as well. All right, so we're at our end now. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down. And you see I have a section here. It's a little, basically what a rubric could look like. And I'll premise this by saying I'm really into grading the process. I'm really against standardized testing in their current form. I don't really think they do a good job of actually assessing students and what they know, nor do I think they are a good measure of what a teacher is able to do with their students. And so I'm really into rubrics. That's why I wrote this here. I want us to focus on this idea of grading students in a way where we're less concerned with what they can memorize in a night, and we're more concerned with what they're actually doing in the classroom. So remember, we're talking about comparing and contrasting each of these days. That's the big action that students are doing, and we need to ask ourselves, what does that look like for students to compare and contrast well? And you can do that with any skill in the social studies, like say discussion, or communication, debate. Any of these things, we can break them down, be like, what does it look like to be, a good debater? Or what does it look like to be a good discussant, a good presenter, a good question creator? And we can create rubrics around it. I never really tried it with super young students, but you could even ask older students to also pitch in an idea of what does it mean to be proficient at comparing and contrasting. If you have some examples of what it looks like to compare and contrast well from past students, you could ask, you could hand out those, pieces of paper of, past students doing well, and ask your students hey, what's good about this? And from that conversation, you can actually create, points on a rubric that the students have to try to, master. And so here I have some questions about, what it might do to help guide creating a rubric. And really, it's just this idea of grading the process, grading the action. Don't focus so much on can students tell me exactly, 3 or 4 of the important people that I told them in my slides about the 1918 influenza pandemic. Again, I think students just trying to memorize that stuff all the time isn't doing them any good. It's an important part of school in a certain sense. It needs to be a part of it, but not necessarily the entire thing. So when you're doing an activity like this, again, we really need to be thinking of what big skills are we trying to do here. And if you're curious more about that idea and that concept, it's called skill-based learning. I'll even type it right quick just so you can find it yourself. And the concept really focuses on grades, and assessment should be focusing on the skills that we give our students, and then our tests, our assessments, that's what we're doing. We're just making sure that students can do it. I think about my own experience. I like to bring up woodshop examples a lot because I think it's just kind of a less abstract thing to think about. My woodshop lead or instructor, whatever you like to call them, they would make sure we do safety tests first, and we had to learn those skills of every single saw, every single blade, every single sander, every single tool. We had to show that we could do it not only safely but proficiently. Because, if you're a guy cutting, 20 boards within an inch of where they need to be, well, that means the entire building is now off. And so that idea, that concept is we learned a skill, and then after that, our instructor was able to follow us and actually, apply his observational ability and be like, yep, Taylor's doing good. Taylor's cutting all the boards at the exact right length so the entire building won't fall apart. That's the kind of same idea that we need to do with the things that we have in our classes. So again, less focused on can my students memorize 100 facts, and more on can my students compare and contrast at a proficient to advanced level. That should be the goal of the teacher. So that wraps up what we're doing. I'm going to go ahead and close, and we'll see you in a bit. All right, so we're back in the library, and that was an idea about looking for disciplinary concepts, and then even thinking a little bit about assessments. Assessment isn't a specific component or dimension of the C3 framework. If they ever do a redo of the C3 framework, kind of like what we do with our state standards, that actually would be something I really push for, that's what I would push for, is we need to have more focus on assessment and that idea of what does it actually mean to assess, because I think a lot of teachers get afraid of that concept of, how do we actually assess students without over relying on multiple choice, questions and essays, because really that's the two big the ones I see is multiple choice and then some kind of writing reflection. And all those are important. Students need to learn how to write, and students do need to be able to have a certain amount of content knowledge. That cannot and should not be the end goal. The end goal is far more important. It's students' ability to compare and contrast, or all the other different concepts in social studies, which you have access through the state standards and the C3. So that is it for now. Next week is our final week, which is great. I've been really enjoying these moments with the teachers and the conversations that have come from them. And next week we're focusing on finding sources, and so I'll really be focusing on the idea of where to get good primary and secondary sources, and then also how do we actually put them into our lesson plan, which will be done next week. So I'll be very excited to share a complete model for everyone. And again, as always, ask questions either during the video or after. You can reach out to me or Melinda Johnson. Either one of us would be just ecstatic to have a conversation with you. So for now, that is it. Everyone have a great day and take care. Bye.